Does Deltarune have a filler problem? When talking about different media, filler is always a complicated topic. If you're a fan of different animes, TV shows, or hell even games, you'll probably hear the word filler tossed around different fandoms. Deltarune is no stranger to this word being tossed around by the community. Most namely, Chapter 3 and 5 have periodically been called filler by several members of the community. I love literature. I have spent countless hours of my life creative writing, and I love Deltarune too. Another game series I have dedicated thousands of hours of my life into. So when I heard that some individuals in the Undertale fandom are calling Deltarune Chapter 3 and 5 filler, I wanted to look at these claims not in any sort of negative way, but apply what I know about creative writing to Deltarune and see if I can find any sort of definitive answer as to whether Chapter 3 and Chapter 5 are necessarily filler. So if you like listening to my autistic rambles of things that don't need to be rambled about, then you should definitely subscribe. I do videos like this all the time, and if you like watching stuff that doesn't matter in the slightest, then this is definitely the channel for you. So what is filler? Why does filler exist? Well, it's kinda hard to explain, but I'll try my best. In a storytelling sense, filler is often used to pad out a story whenever it needs it. This can be done on a small scale or a much larger scale depending on the narrative that's set up. Traditional filler, the filler that everyone thinks about, is when a story gets stopped abruptly and absolutely everything gets put on hold. No meaningful character development happens, there's no meaningful additions to the lore, and story progression as a whole just stops. This can be done for a variety of different reasons. For example, if the writers haven't had enough time to properly finish writing what's supposed to be next in the narrative. Filler can also be used on a much smaller scale. For example, instead of the narrative just stopping for a bunch of episodes while the writers make more time to write the next part of the story, smaller scale filler can be used to pad out runtime. For example, a fight scene. Sometimes narratives can create fight scenes that are much longer than they need to be for the purpose of just rounding out events of the story and slowing down the pacing. And genuinely, sometimes smaller scale filler like that can be a good thing. If you're writing a story and simply writing in two characters fight just because the fight scene needed to happen to progress the narrative, then it can seem to rush and the next plot point could feel unearned due to its fast pacing. Anyway, the point is, let's take this analysis of filler and apply it to Deltarune. Why do people think that specifically Chapter 3 and Chapter 5 are filler? Well, I think I can see where these claims are coming from. Deltarune chapters have a specific formula that each one tends to follow. There's an overarching plot that progresses throughout the entire game, and in each chapter there's a plot that's specific to that chapter. Each chapter tends to have its own unique antagonist or goal, and with that antagonist, it allows the overarching narrative to progress further. Obviously, there's other elements to the story that Toby's telling than just that, but this is the basic principle that Deltarune has been following since Chapter 1. So you can imagine that by Chapter 3, this formula has gotten a little repetitive. Because unless you're looking at the finer details of each Deltarune chapter and looking at what each character is saying and expressing towards others, yeah, it can feel like the narrative just isn't progressing or the pacing is way slower than it needs to be. When Chapter 3 and 4 were released simultaneously, it was destined for both of these chapters to be compared to each other. Chapter 4 was a massive chapter. There was tons of lore reveals and the stakes have never been higher than in this chapter specifically. I can see without a doubt in my mind why a lot of people deem this to be their favorite chapter, especially in comparison to Chapter 3. While there is character development in Chapter 4, Chapter 4 focuses a lot on lore reveals, and it's all done in a completely satisfying manner. So yeah, Chapter 4 is a lot of people's favorite, which begs the question as to why Chapter 3 tried to execute the same repetitive formula that Chapter 1 and 2 established. When Chapter 3 and 4 came out, people looked at Chapter 3 and felt a little underwhelmed in comparison. After experiencing Chapter 1 and 2 with very similar formulas, Chapter 3 following that exact same formula with minor alterations to it, made it feel very underwhelming in the grand scheme of things. People are ready for the next major story reveal. They're ready for the narrative to have a major progression, and eventually they get it. Deltarune Chapter 4 works extremely well. Almost everything about it is executed in a way that so many fans love. But do you know why this execution works as well as it did? Well, it's because of Chapter 3. While Chapter 3 might not be everyone's favorite chapter in a narrative sense, a lot of people can agree that reveal at the end with Tenna being destroyed by the Roaring Knight and then it throwing you into a battle out of nowhere might be one of of the most insane and satisfying moments, not just in Deltarune, the entire series. But the reason this reveal worked as well as it did was because of the formula that was already pre-established in chapters 1 and 2. Going into chapter 3, you are led to believe fully that this chapter is going to follow the exact same formula that chapters 1 and 2 set up. Before the ending reveal of chapter 3, we were already shown in this story the pacing, the characters, and the settings. By creating this extremely basic formula all the way back in chapter 1, the ending reveal of chapter 3 is all that more satisfying by completely defying your expectations by denying that formula. By creating this ending reveal, it paved the way for an amazing chapter 4. And not only that, chapter 3 does other things for chapter 4 as well. While chapter 4 relies heavily on the reveal at the end of chapter 3 for its plot, it also relies heavily on all the character development that each chapter was setting up from before this point. I think Deltarune's main problem these days is that plot reveals that are happening have already been figured out by the community because they were foreshadowed in previous chapters. At the beginning of chapter 3, Ralsei explains what exactly darkners are, as in he essentially turns to the camera and explains it in so much detail as possible that darkners cannot exist without their fountains. They cannot travel into the light world at all, and a lot of fans going into this chapter have mostly figured this out by themselves. This is all simply because of foreshadowing and just context clues in general. So at the beginning, when Ralsei relays the exposition to us in chapter 3, some fans may wonder why this exposition is even needed. Well, actually it serves a whole bunch of purposes, not just to reveal lore to the audience. The character development in this chapter is primarily focused on Susie and by extension the Fun Gang as a whole. That Ralsei can never leave the dark world. By extension, all of their friends that are darkners. The reason this character development can even work throughout this chapter is because of the beginning exposition that Ralsei gives to us. Whenever I'm analyzing the story of Deltarune, I often think about Susie. She's often relayed to us as the pure clueless one. So when something in the story needs to get across to the player, Susie will often ask it first, and then Ralsei or another character will relay what needs to be said specifically to her, and by extension, us the player. So keeping with the consistent theming of chapter 3, there's kind of two sides here. There's Susie, who's upset that she can't have fun with her darkner friends in the light world, and then there's Tenna, who wants to keep the Fun Gang in the dark world as long as possible because he wants to keep having fun with them. This is what contributes to Susie eventually accepting what she was initially upset about, not being able to have fun with her friends that she made. This directly leads into chapter 4's character development for her, where she has to come to the realization that the dark world isn't just about having fun with friends. This can potentially be a world-ending event that she is tasked to stop. This then continues into chapter 5, where the events of that chapter finally makes her realize that she needs to tell Noelle the truth about the dark worlds. What's going on is incredibly serious, and more people need to be made aware of it. And to think all of this development with Susie can happen because chapter 3 needed to exist. When chapter 5 released, it had a lot to live up to, especially after all the massive lore reveals of chapter 4. So when chapter 5 released and it didn't have as many lore reveals as chapter 4, you can imagine why a lot of people were disappointed. The hype for this chapter was off the charts and people's expectations were way too high. But could you really blame them? After all the events that happened in chapter 4 and the halfway mark of the game finally being attained, it can be fair to expect chapter 5 to once again continue to have major lore reveals, but in the grand scheme of things, the lore reveals of this chapter are even less than what was revealed in chapter 3. So is it understandable why people were disappointed? Yeah, but the lack of lore reveals doesn't mean that this chapter's story was bad. Far from it. After replaying chapter 5 a couple of times, and hell, even after my first playthrough of it, I realized why this chapter exists. It's not to create an unbelievable reveal that's going to cause good reaction compilations on YouTube. It's not meant to create major lore reveals. No, that was chapter 4. Chapter 5 focuses primarily on not just character development, but morals. Philosophical questions that needed to be answered and addressed in this story. Like when Flowery asks the Fun Gang why the Castletown Dark Fountain is the only one that is allowed to remain open. If these dark fountains are as world-ending as the prophecy describes, are the heroes of light actually heroes if they're putting everyone's lives in danger for their own selfish desires? And I think the individual asking this question, Flowery, is the perfect character to ask it. Flowers cannot enter Castletown because they're flowers. So it's not fair for them that their dark fountain is sealed and then they have nowhere to go after. Another important aspect of this chapter is Ralsei. Throughout this chapter, he is pissed. Like pissed all the time, especially at Flowery. Flowery. This is because of a bunch of different reasons. But the main one is because Flowery pretty much ignores every rule of Deltarune that has been set up thus far. He creates his own statistics, money, gear. He acts like he's completely self-aware. Naturally, Ralsei, who is completely by the book and likes following the prophecy, would be upset at a character like Flowery because, well, he's breaking all the rules that Ralsei is putting a lot of effort into following. But the reason Ralsei being pissed off in the first place even works in this chapter is because of what he went through in chapter 4. Susie snapping at him for not telling them all the information, and the ending scene after the Titan where Ralsei breaks down due to the ending of the prophecy. The reason Ralsei and Flowery's dynamic is so impactful and prevalent is because of what was set up in chapter 4. And the setup in chapter 4 only works because of the setup in chapter 3. I think after analyzing all these years of Deltarune being slowly released, I've come to a conclusion of sorts. People care way too much about deep lore. I don't think that's what Deltarune is meant to be about. Sure, there is deep lore and it's okay to be obsessed with that lore, but a lot of the other moments of the story often get overlooked because people just want to see more deep lore reveals. Who's the knight? What is Gaster's role in this? I don't think Deltarune was ever created with lore as its primary focus in mind. I mean, even in the trailer for chapter 3 and 4, it's expressed that this is meant to be a story about friendship with an ending that's meant to be super impactful. It's meant to be about falling in love with the characters, their hardships, their struggles, and the moments that they're genuinely having fun. And isn't that what Undertale was always about from the start? I think I get it. People are quick to call certain Deltarune chapters filler because of the lack of reveals and lore drops, and don't get me wrong, it's fine to be disappointed in the lack of these things, but the plot is still progressing strong. A narrative doesn't have to strictly rely on deep lore to be a good story, and eventually we will get those reveals. But the reason those reveals work so well in the first place is because of all the character development that has been established prior to the point of said reveal. The ending of chapter 3 and all of chapter 4 is proof that that method works. Chapter 5 can't work without chapter 4, and chapter 4 can't work without chapter 3. So to put it simply, is chapter 3 and chapter 5 filler? The short answer, no.